The sun blazed crimson against the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Wyatt, Missouri. As Vivian Vance backed against the weathered saloon wall, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The man before her was no ordinary drifter, Silas Blackthorn, the most feared gunslinger this side of the Mississippi, his cold eyes reflecting nothing but murderous intent as he leveled his Colt at her face. "Nowhere left to run, Miss Vance," Blackthorn drawled, the dying sunlight glinting off his silver spurs. "You've caused me enough trouble. Time to collect what's owed." Vivian's throat went dry, her fingers clutching the small leather pouch hidden in the folds of her skirt, the very thing this monster had killed her father for. "I don't have what you're looking for," she lied, desperately scanning the street for help. The township of Wyatt had gone deadly quiet, townsfolk scattering like mice before a hungry cat at the first sign of Blackthorn's arrival. All except one man. Frederick Hayes stepped out from the shadow of the livery stable, his boots kicking up dust as he approached with measured strides. Unlike Blackthorn, whose dark attire and flashy silver guns screamed danger, Frederick wore simple work clothes, a faded blue shirt, worn denim, and a weathered brown hat pulled low over his eyes. The only thing that marked him as anything more than a common ranch hand was the steady way he carried himself and the gleam of determination in his eyes. "That's far enough, Blackthorn," Frederick called, his voice carrying across the empty street. The gunslinger turned slightly, keeping Vivian pinned against the wall but shifting enough to assess this new threat. His lip curled into a sneer. "This ain't your business, cowboy. Walk away while you still can." Frederick's hand hovered near his holster. He wasn't a gunfighter by trade, but he'd lived enough hard years in the West to know how to handle himself. His eyes met Vivian's for a brief, electric moment. "Run to me," he said simply, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. Blackthorn's face contorted with rage. "You're dead, cowboy." In one fluid motion, his gun swung toward Frederick. Vivian didn't hesitate. The moment Blackthorn's attention shifted, she bolted, her skirts bunched in her hands as she sprinted across the dusty thoroughfare. The crack of gunfire split the air behind her, but she didn't look back, didn't slow. She ran straight for the stranger who'd put his life on the line for her. Frederick drew his revolver with practiced precision, firing twice as Vivian reached his side. One bullet went wide, but the second found its mark, tearing through Blackthorn's shooting arm. The gunslinger howled in pain, his weapon dropping to the dirt. "Get behind me," Frederick ordered, pushing Vivian toward the cover of the livery stable. His eyes never left Blackthorn, who was clutching his bloodied arm, face twisted with hatred. "This isn't over," the wounded gunslinger spat, backing away toward where his horse was hitched. "You're both dead." Frederick kept his gun trained on the retreating man. "Leave Wyatt and don't come back, or the next bullet finds your heart." Only when Blackthorn had mounted his horse and galloped out of town did Frederick lower his weapon. He turned to the woman pressed against the stable wall, her chest heaving with exertion and fear. "Are you hurt, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Vivian shook her head, auburn curls escaping from her once neat bun. "No, thanks to you." Her green eyes studied him warily. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Frederick holstered his gun. "I don't much care for men who threaten women." He extended a calloused hand. "Frederick Hayes." She hesitated only briefly before taking it. "Vivian Vance." Their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary before she pulled away, adjusting her disheveled clothing. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "Silas Blackthorn doesn't give up so easily." "What does he want from you?" Vivian's hand unconsciously moved to the hidden pouch, something that wasn't his to take. She glanced nervously down the street. "I can't stay here." Frederick nodded thoughtfully, then gestured to the livery. "I've got a horse inside. Pack whatever you need, we'll leave at first light." Her brow furrowed. "I can't ask you to, you didn't ask," he interrupted. "But Blackthorn won't be riding alone when he returns. You'll need someone watching your back until you reach somewhere safe." Vivian studied him, wondering what had brought this man to Wyatt, and why he would offer such help to someone he'd just met. But with the sun disappearing below the horizon and Blackthorn surely gathering reinforcements, she had little choice but to trust him. "First light, then," she agreed, straightening her shoulders with renewed determination. "I'll be ready." The night passed in uneasy watchfulness. Frederick secured rooms at the modest hotel for both of them, though he spent most of the hours sitting vigilant by the window, his revolver close at hand. Vivian packed her few belongings, including a small photograph of her father and the troublesome leather pouch that had brought Blackthorn's wrath upon her. When dawn broke, casting pale light across the sleepy town, Frederick was waiting with 2 saddled horses in front of the hotel. Vivian emerged wearing practical riding clothes, a split skirt and sturdy boots, her hair tied back beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "You're punctual," she observed, approaching the horses. "In my experience, being late in this country often means being dead." He helped secure her bag to the saddle. "I thought we'd head west toward Kansas City. Easier to disappear in a bigger town." Vivian mounted her horse with practiced ease. "I have family in Colorado if we could make it there." Frederick nodded, swinging into his saddle. "Colorado it is, then." They rode out of Wyatt as the town was just beginning to stir, taking the western trail at a steady pace. Frederick kept them off the main roads where possible, choosing instead the less traveled paths through rolling countryside. By midday, they had put considerable distance between themselves and Wyatt, stopping only briefly to rest the horses by a small creek. As Vivian filled their canteens, she felt Frederick's eyes on her. "You handle yourself well in the saddle," he commented. "Not many city women ride like that." She smiled slightly. "I wasn't always in Wyatt. My father and I ran a small horse ranch outside Denver until—" Her smile faded. "Until we lost it. We came east looking for a fresh start." Frederick nodded, not pressing further. "We should keep moving." "I'd like to reach the Jenkins homestead before nightfall. Their good people won't ask too many questions." As they remounted, Vivian hesitated. "Mr. Hayes, I haven't properly thanked you for what you did yesterday." "Frederick," he corrected, "and there's no need for thanks." "There is," she insisted. "Most men would have walked away. You didn't even know me." His eyes, a deep blue she hadn't fully noticed before, met hers steadily. "Sometimes a man just knows when something's worth fighting for, Miss Vance." "Vivian," she replied softly. A hint of a smile touched his lips as he nudged his horse forward. "Vivian, then." They rode in companionable silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape gradually changed from open prairie to more wooded terrain, offering welcome shade from the afternoon sun. It was near this woodland that Frederick suddenly raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Riders," he said quietly, nodding toward dust clouds visible in the distance behind them. 4, maybe 5. Vivian's stomach knotted with dread. "Blackthorn." "Can't tell from here, but we shouldn't wait to find out." He scanned their surroundings, quickly assessing options. "There's a ravine about half a mile ahead that leads into those woods, if we can reach it before they spot us." They urged their horses forward at a gallop, racing for the tree line. The ravine Frederick had mentioned was narrow but navigable, descending steeply between rocky walls before opening into the dense forest beyond. They just entered its shadow when the distant sound of shouting confirmed their fears they'd been spotted. "Keep moving," Frederick called, drawing his revolver as they plunged deeper into the ravine. Gunfire cracked behind them, bullets ricocheting off stone walls. Vivian leaned low over her horse's neck, heart hammering as they weaved through the narrowing passage. The forest ahead promised cover, if they could just reach it before their pursuers closed the gap. A bullet whizzed past Frederick's ear, close enough that he felt its heat. He twisted in his saddle, returning fire more to slow their attackers than with any real hope of hitting them at this distance. The maneuver cost him precious seconds of attention enough that he failed to see the fallen log partially blocking the path ahead. His horse balked at the last moment, nearly unseating him. Vivian had already cleared the obstacle and was several yards ahead when she realized Frederick wasn't beside her. She reined in, turning to see him struggling to control his frightened mount as riders appeared at the mouth of the ravine. "Go!" he shouted, gesturing frantically for her to continue. "I'll hold them off." But Vivian Vance had not survived this long by abandoning those who helped her. Instead of fleeing, she reached for the rifle secured to her saddle, drew it smoothly, and took aim past Frederick at the approaching riders. The crack of her shot echoed through the ravine, striking the lead rider's shoulder and sending him tumbling from his horse. The others pulled up short, momentarily stunned by the unexpected resistance. Frederick used the distraction to vault his horse over the log, spurring hard to reach Vivian's position. "You're full of surprises, Miss Vance," he said with newfound respect as they plunged together into the forest. "My father taught me more than horsemanship," she replied, tucking the rifle away as they navigated between close-set trees. "And I told you it's Vivian." The dense woodland slowed their pursuers, allowing Frederick and Vivian to gradually increase their lead. By the time dusk settled over the land, they had lost all signs of being followed, though neither was willing to completely lower their guard. The Jenkins homestead appeared as Frederick had promised, a sturdy cabin set in a small clearing, with smoke rising cheerfully from its chimney. An older man stepped onto the porch as they approached, shotgun resting casually in the crook of his arm. "That you, Hayes?" he called cautiously. "It's me, Ezra," Frederick confirmed, raising a hand in greeting. "Hope you've got room for 2 weary travelers tonight." Ezra Jenkins lowered his shotgun, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "For you, always." His gaze shifted curiously to Vivian. "And your companion, Vivian Vance," Frederick said. "She's in some trouble and we could use a safe place for the night." The older man nodded without pressing for details. "Martha's just putting supper on. Come on in, both of you." The Jenkins hospitality proved as genuine as Frederick had suggested. Martha, a kind-faced woman with silver-streaked dark hair, served a hearty meal of venison stew and cornbread, fussing over them like long-lost children. After dinner, she showed Vivian to a small but clean bedroom while Ezra and Frederick settled by the fireplace with cups of strong coffee. "What kind of trouble?" Ezra asked bluntly once the women were out of earshot. Frederick sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Silas Blackthorn." Ezra's expression darkened. "Mean Sanu Vabich. What's he want with the lady?" "I'm not entirely sure," Frederick admitted. "But he's determined enough that he's got men tracking us. We're headed to Colorado, hoping to lose them along the way." The older man nodded thoughtfully. "I can give you supplies, maybe a different horse for the lady. Blackthorn knows that bay she's riding. I'd appreciate that." Frederick stared into his coffee. "I didn't plan on playing hero when I rode into Wyatt yesterday. Few ever do," Ezra replied with a knowing look. "Yet here you are." Later, when the household had retired for the night, Frederick stepped out onto the porch, needing a moment of solitude to clear his head. The night was cool, stars scattered across the velvet sky like diamonds. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear Vivian's approach until she spoke. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked softly. He turned to find her wrapped in a shawl borrowed from Martha, her hair loose around her shoulders. The moonlight caught in its auburn waves, giving her an almost ethereal appearance. "Just making sure we haven't been followed," he said, though both knew it was partly an excuse. Vivian moved to stand beside him, leaning against the porch railing. "Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins are good people." "They are," Frederick agreed. "Ezra saved my life once, years back. I was working as a ranch hand up north when rustlers hit. Got shot up pretty bad. He found me half dead on the trail and nursed me back to health." "You've had an interesting life, Frederick Hayes," he smiled faintly. "Not always by choice." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. Finally, Vivian spoke again, her voice hesitant. "I owe you an explanation about Blackthorn." Frederick shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "I do," she insisted, turning to face him. In the moonlight, her green eyes were luminous with emotion. "You've risked your life for me without even knowing why." He met her gaze steadily. "All right, I'm listening." Vivian reached into her pocket and withdrew the leather pouch she'd guarded so carefully. Slowly, she untied its drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm, a gold pocket watch and a folded piece of paper. "My father wasn't just a rancher," she began. "Before we settled in Colorado, he worked for the Treasury Department. He was investigating a counterfeiting operation led by Silas Blackthorn." Frederick's eyebrows rose slightly. "Blackthorn's a counterfeiter, among other things. My father gathered evidence against him, including the names of his accomplices, government officials who were helping him." She indicated the folded paper. "It's all here. But before he could deliver his findings, Blackthorn's men caught up to us. They killed my father." Her voice broke on the last words. Frederick resisted the urge to take her hand, sensing she needed to finish her story uninterrupted. "I managed to escape with his watch and this list. We'd been heading to Wyatt to meet his contact in the Treasury Department when Blackthorn found us. I've been hiding there for nearly 2 months, waiting for another agent to arrive." She looked up at Frederick, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "And then you appeared instead." "I'm sorry about your father," Frederick said softly. "No wonder Blackthorn's so determined." Vivian carefully returned the items to the pouch. "This evidence could hang him and expose corrupt officials in 3 states. He won't stop until he has it, or until I'm dead." "Or until he's brought to justice," Frederick added firmly. She gave him a sad smile. "Justice seems in short supply these days." "Not always." He finally allowed himself to touch her, a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We'll reach Colorado, find someone you can trust with that information, I promise." Vivian looked up at him, studying his face in the moonlight. "Why are you doing this, Frederick? Really?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Frederick considered his answer carefully. "When I saw you cornered against that saloon wall," he said eventually, "I saw something in your eyes, not just fear but defiance, courage." His hand moved from her shoulder to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "I thought to myself, there's a woman worth fighting for." The air between them seemed to change, charged with something neither was ready to name. For a moment, Vivian thought he might kiss her for a moment she wanted him to. Instead, Frederick stepped back, breaking the spell. "We should both get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Long ride ahead tomorrow." Vivian nodded, gathering her shawl more tightly around herself. "Good night, Frederick." "Good night, Vivian." As she disappeared back into the cabin, Frederick returned his gaze to the stars, wondering what fate had brought him to Wyatt, Missouri, just when Vivian Vance needed him most, and what that same fate might have in store for them in the days ahead. Dawn came early at the Jenkins homestead. the first golden rays of sunlight filtering through the trees as Frederick and Vivian prepared for departure. True to his word, Ezra had arranged a different mount for Vivian, a sturdy dappled mare with surprising speed for her size. "She's called Storm," Ezra explained as Vivian stroked the horse's velvety nose. "Don't let her gentle ways fool you. She's outrun more than one posse in her day." Martha had packed them provisions enough for several days' jerky, biscuits, dried fruit, and coffee, all carefully bundled into saddlebags alongside fresh blankets and additional ammunition. "The route you're planning takes you through some rough country," Ezra warned as he and Frederick pored over a rough map spread on the kitchen table. "Apache territory here," he indicated, "and these hills are favorite hiding spots for outlaws." Frederick nodded grimly. "What would you suggest?" "Follow the creek west for about 10 miles, then cut north through Miller's Pass." Ezra traced the path with a weathered finger. "Adds a day to your journey, but fewer eyes watching." As the women loaded the last of the supplies, Ezra pulled Frederick aside. "One more thing," he said quietly, pressing a folded piece of paper into his hand. "If you get in real trouble, find this man in Hayes City. Tell him Ezra sent you." Frederick glanced at the name scribbled on the paper, then tucked it securely into his shirt pocket. "Thank you, Ezra, for everything." The older man clapped him on the shoulder. "Just bring yourself back in one piece. And the lady, too," he added with a knowing look that Frederick chose to ignore. Their goodbyes were brief but heartfelt, with promises to visit again under better circumstances. As they rode away from the homestead, Vivian glanced back at the diminishing figures of Ezra and Martha Jenkins. "There really are good people left in this world," she remarked softly. Frederick smiled. "More than you might think." They followed Ezra's suggested route, keeping to the creek with its helpful covering of trees. The day grew warm, but not unpleasantly so, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed grass. Under different circumstances, it might have been a pleasant journey through beautiful country. As they rode, Vivian found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. Frederick Hayes was a contradiction, a man clearly accustomed to the harsh realities of frontier life, yet possessed of an unexpected gentleness. He rode with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, his movements fluid and natural. When he thought she wasn't looking, his expression often turned thoughtful, almost melancholy. "You never told me what brought you to Wyatt," she said when they stopped to water the horses around midday. Frederick looked up from adjusting his saddle. "Didn't I? Not much to tell. I was between jobs, heard the livery in Wyatt needed help. That's all, just passing through," he shrugged. "That's been my life for the past few years, moving from place to place, finding work where I can." Vivian filled her canteen from the creek. "No home, no family." A shadow passed over his features. Had both once, lost them in '73. The simple statement contained volumes of unspoken pain. Vivian wanted to ask more, but sensed the wounds were still raw despite the passing years. "I'm sorry," she said instead. Frederick nodded acknowledgement, then changed the subject. "We should reach Miller's Pass by evening. There's an old trapper's cabin there where we can spend the night." They continued their journey, the conversation shifting to less personal topics, the changing landscape, memories of Colorado, predictions about the weather. By late afternoon, they'd left the creek behind and begun the gentle ascent into more rugged terrain. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, with Frederick taking the lead. It was in this formation that they entered the pass, a winding path between towering rock walls that glowed amber in the late sunlight. The beauty of the scene was captivating, almost enough to make them forget the danger that had driven them here. Almost. Frederick, Vivian called suddenly, her voice tight with alarm. "Look!" He reined in his horse, following her gaze to the ridge above them. There, silhouetted against the sky, was a lone rider watching their progress. Even at this distance, Frederick recognized the distinctive shape of Blackthorn's hat. "He's found us," Vivian whispered, fear evident in her voice. Frederick's mind raced through their options. They were committed to the pass now. Turning back would only lead them into open country where they'd be easy targets. "Keep moving," he decided, urging his horse forward at a faster pace. "The cabin's not far. If we can reach it before dark, we'll have shelter for the night." They pushed on, acutely aware of the watcher on the ridge. To their relief, the figure didn't immediately give chase, perhaps waiting for reinforcements or simply tracking their direction. Either way, Frederick knew their advantage was temporary at best. The trapper's cabin appeared as the last daylight faded, a simple log structure nestled against the mountainside, partially concealed by pine trees. It was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a single window covered by wooden shutters. "Get inside," Frederick instructed as they dismounted. "I'll see to the horses." While Vivian lit a lantern and assessed their shelter, Frederick led the animals to a lean-to at the rear of the cabin. He worked quickly, unsaddling them and ensuring they had water from a nearby spring. All the while, his eyes scanned the darkening landscape for any sign of pursuit. Inside, Vivian had found the cabin surprisingly well maintained. A small iron stove occupied one corner, its chimney pipe extending through the roof. A narrow cot lined one wall, while shelves stocked with basic supplies, dried beans, coffee, salt suggested occasional use by passing travelers. Ezra said trappers still use this place seasonally, Frederick explained as he entered, bolting the door behind him. "Seems they keep it stocked for emergencies." Vivian had already started a small fire in the stove, its warmth welcome in the cooling mountain air. "Did you see anyone following?" Frederick shook his head. "Not yet, but Blackthorn knows where we are. Why hasn't he attacked?" "He had the advantage of height back there. My guess, he's waiting for his men to catch up." Frederick checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. "Or he knows this country better than we do and has something else planned." The uncertainty of their situation settled over them like a physical weight. They ate a simple meal from their provisions, speaking little, each lost in private thoughts. Afterward, Frederick insisted on taking first watch while Vivian rested. "I'm not sure I could sleep anyway," she objected. "Try," he urged gently. "We may need to move quickly tomorrow. You'll need your strength." Reluctantly, she settled on the cot, pulling a blanket around herself. Frederick positioned himself by the window, partially opening the shutter to survey the night. Stars glittered in the clear mountain sky, providing just enough light to make out the shapes of the nearest trees. For nearly an hour, silence reigned, broken only by the occasional crackle from the stove and the distant call of a night bird. Frederick was beginning to think they might pass the night undisturbed when a faint sound caught his attention, the unmistakable clink of a spur against stone. He tensed, hand moving to his gun. Peering more intently into the darkness, he could just make out movement, shadows sliding between trees, approaching the cabin from multiple directions. "Vivian," he whispered urgently. "They're here." She was instantly awake, reaching for her rifle. "How many? Can't tell." "At least 3, maybe more." He moved silently across the cabin, checking the back window. "They're surrounding us." Vivian's face was pale but determined in the dim light. "What do we do?" Before Frederick could answer, a voice called from outside, not Blackthorn's, but one of his men. "We know you're in there, Hayes. Send out the woman and her father's papers, and maybe we'll let you live." Frederick and Vivian exchanged glances. The fact that their pursuers were negotiating rather than simply attacking suggested they weren't completely confident in their position. "And if we refuse?" Frederick called back, playing for time as he assessed their options. A different voice answered, cold, controlled, unmistakably Blackthorn's. "Then we burn you out, Cowboy. Your choice." Frederick's mind raced. The cabin's log construction wouldn't catch fire easily, but the roof was another matter. Once aflame, they'd have minutes at most before it collapsed. "I count 5 of them," he whispered to Vivian. "Too many to fight head-on." She clutched the leather pouch that had caused all this trouble. "I could give them the list. It's not worth dying for." "Your father thought it was," Frederick reminded her gently, "and once they have it, they have no reason to keep either of us alive." Outside, they could hear the men growing restless. "Time's up," Blackthorn called. "What's it gonna be?" Frederick made his decision. "There's a trail behind the cabin that leads up into the mountains. It's narrow but passable. If one of us created a distraction, the other could slip away." Vivian immediately shook her head. "I'm not leaving you to face them alone." "Listen to me," he insisted, taking her hands in his. "That evidence needs to reach the proper authorities. You need to survive to make sure your father's death wasn't in vain." "And what about you?" her voice caught. "After everything you've done for me, how can I just, hey?" Blackthorn shouted from outside, interrupting them. "Last chance before we start shooting." Frederick's eyes locked with Vivian's. "Do you trust me?" After a heartbeat's hesitation, she nodded. "Then here's what we'll do." Outside, Blackthorn's patience had run out. He signaled to his men to prepare torches. They had just begun to light them when the cabin door suddenly burst open. "Hold your fire," Frederick called, stepping out with his hands raised. "Let's talk this through." Blackthorn emerged from the shadows, his wounded arm bandaged but his gun hand steady as he aimed at Frederick's chest. "Where's the woman?" "Safe," Frederick replied evenly. "And the list too?" Blackthorn's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Bring her out." "Not until we have an understanding." Frederick took a calculated step forward. "I know what you're after, Blackthorn. I know about the counterfeiting, the corrupt officials. It's bigger than just you." The gunslinger's face revealed nothing, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "You don't know anything." "I know enough to realize that list is valuable to more people than just you. People who might pay handsomely to keep their names off the gallows." Now Frederick had Blackthorn's full attention. The other men looked uncertainly to their leader, awaiting instructions. "What are you suggesting?" Blackthorn asked cautiously. Frederick shrugged. "A business arrangement. The woman goes free, unharmed. I deliver the list to you at a location of my choosing for a price." "You expect me to believe you'd betray her?" Blackthorn sneered. "After playing hero in Wyatt?" "I expect you to believe I'm a practical man," Frederick replied coolly. "She's nothing to me, just someone who needed help at the time. Now I'm looking out for myself." Doubt flickered across Blackthorn's features. "And where is this list now?" "Somewhere safe." "Not here." Frederick gestured casually toward the cabin. "Feel free to search if you don't believe me." It was a gamble. Blackthorn could simply order his men to shoot Frederick and tear the cabin apart. But Frederick was counting on the gunslinger's cunning. Killing him now would accomplish nothing if the list was truly hidden elsewhere. Blackthorn considered for a long moment, then holstered his gun. "All right, Cowboy, let's hear your terms." Frederick allowed himself a small smile of victory. "The woman leaves now, takes her horse, and rides without being followed. Once I'm sure she's clear, you and I will discuss the exchange. And if I refuse, then you'll never find that list," Frederick said simply. "It dies with me." The standoff stretched for several tense seconds before Blackthorn finally nodded. "Fine. The woman goes free for now, but if you're playing me—" "I'm not a fool," Frederick assured him. "Vivian," he called over his shoulder, "come on out, you're leaving." There was no immediate response from the cabin. Frederick's heart raced as he wondered if she'd followed their plan or if something had gone wrong. "Vivian," he called again, fighting to keep his voice steady. Finally, the cabin door opened wider and Vivian stepped out. She was dressed for riding, her face set in a mask of confusion and betrayal that Frederick knew wasn't entirely feigned. "What's happening?" she demanded. "You're leaving," Frederick told her, not meeting her eyes. "These men have agreed to let you go. In exchange for what?" She looked between him and Blackthorn with growing comprehension. "The list. You're giving them the list," Frederick shrugged. "Business is business. Your father's crusade isn't my concern." The hurt that flashed across her face seemed so genuine that for a moment, Frederick almost broke character to reassure her. Instead, he gestured impatiently toward the horses. "Your mare's ready. I'd suggest you start riding while the offer still stands." Vivian approached him slowly, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "How could you?" He leaned in as if threatening her, using the moment to murmur, "Northwest Trail. Don't stop until daybreak, I'll find you." Louder, he said, "Just looking out for myself, same as anyone would. Now go." With a final look of contempt that concealed the fear she truly felt, Vivian strode to her horse. None of Blackthorn's men moved to stop her as she mounted and turned the mare toward the trail Frederick had indicated. "This isn't over," she called back, playing her role to the end. Only when she had disappeared into the darkness did Blackthorn turn his full attention back to Frederick. "Smart play, Cowboy. Now, about our arrangement." Frederick forced himself to appear relaxed, though every instinct screamed to follow Vivian. "Let's talk inside. It's getting cold out here." As they entered the cabin, Frederick silently prayed that Vivian was safely away and that she would remember the rest of their desperate plan, because without it, neither of them would live to see Colorado. The night stretched endlessly for Vivian as she urged Storm up the narrow mountain trail, darkness pressing in around her like a physical presence. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush, sent her heart racing with fear that Blackthorn's men had followed despite Frederick's bargain. Frederick's betrayal had seemed so convincing that for one terrible moment, she had doubted him. Then his whispered instructions had confirmed what her heart already knew: he was creating a diversion to ensure her escape, placing himself in mortal danger for her sake. Northwest Trail. "Don't stop until daybreak. I'll find you." Would he, though? Even if he somehow survived his confrontation with Blackthorn, how would he find her in this wilderness? What if he'd only said those words to give her hope, knowing full well he was sacrificing himself? The thoughts tormented her as she rode, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. The trail grew steeper, winding between massive boulders and scraggly pines that clung precariously to the mountainside. In places, it narrowed to little more than a ledge, forcing her to trust Storm's sure-footedness in the darkness. After what seemed like hours, the trail opened into a small plateau, offering a brief respite from the challenging terrain. Vivian allowed Storm to rest, dismounting to stretch her cramped muscles while scanning the valley below for any sign of pursuit. In the moonlight, she could make out the distant shape of the trapper's cabin, now merely a dark speck against the mountainside. No flames, no gunfire. What was happening down there? Was Frederick still alive? The leather pouch rested heavily against her side, where she'd transferred it from its hiding place in the cabin to a pocket sewn into her riding skirt. Frederick had insisted she take it, arguing that if their plan failed, she would need to continue the journey to Colorado alone. "I'll create a forgery," he had explained hurriedly as they prepared for Blackthorn's arrival. "Something that will look genuine enough to buy time, but won't endanger anyone if Blackthorn gets his hands on it." Now, as she remounted and continued her ascent, Vivian wondered what price Frederick might be paying for that deception. Dawn found her at the edge of a forest, the trail continuing westward through tall pines. Exhaustion weighed on her, but fear kept her moving until the sun was well above the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to stop in a small clearing beside a bubbling stream. Storm drank gratefully while Vivian forced herself to eat some jerky from her saddlebags. As she did, she took stock of her situation. She had provisions for several days, ammunition for her rifle, and a general sense of direction toward Colorado. What she didn't have was a map, knowledge of the terrain ahead, or any certainty that Frederick would survive to join her. She had just decided to rest for an hour before continuing when Storm's ears pricked forward, alert to a sound Vivian couldn't yet detect. Instantly wary, she reached for her rifle, scanning the trees for any movement. A horse's whinny echoed from the direction she had come. Someone was following the same trail. With no time to flee, Vivian positioned herself behind a large boulder, rifle aimed at the path. Moments later, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Vivian's finger tensed on the trigger, then relaxed as recognition dawned. "Frederick," he looked up, relief washing over his exhausted features as he spotted her. His clothing was dirty and torn. A bloody scratch marked his cheek, but he was miraculously alive. Vivian dropped her rifle and ran to him as he dismounted, throwing her arms around him in an embrace that surprised them both with its intensity. "I thought you were dead," she murmured against his chest, not caring about propriety or what he might think of such an emotional display. His arms tightened around her. "Came close a time or two," he admitted, his voice rough with fatigue. When they finally separated, Vivian noticed how haggard he looked, dark circles shadowing his eyes. "What happened? How did you escape?" Frederick sank gratefully onto a fallen log, accepting the canteen she offered. "Blackthorn wasn't entirely convinced by my act. He and his men searched the cabin, found nothing, then decided to take me to their camp for more persuasive discussions." His tone suggested how unpleasant those discussions might have been, making Vivian wince. "We were about an hour's ride from the cabin when I made my move," he continued. "Created a distraction with some gunpowder I'd pocketed from the trapper's supplies, managed to get to my horse in the confusion." He took another long drink. "They gave chase for a while, but I know these mountains better than they do. Used to hunt these parts years back. Are they still following?" Frederick shook his head. "I doubled back twice, laid false trails. By now they're probably halfway to Kansas, following tracks that lead nowhere." Vivian's shoulders sagged with relief. "So we're safe, for the moment." He gave her a weary smile, "but we should keep moving. There's a settlement about 2 days' ride from here where we can resupply and send a telegram to your contacts in Colorado." The mention of Colorado reminded Vivian of their ultimate purpose. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing the leather pouch. "The list is safe. Your plan worked." Frederick nodded, a shadow passing over his features. "Blackthorn wasn't pleased when he realized the papers I gave him were worthless. He'll be even less pleased when he discovers where we're headed. You think he'll figure it out, eventually? Men like him don't give up easily." Frederick stood, wincing slightly. "Which is why we shouldn't linger." Vivian noticed the wince. "You're hurt." "Just sore," he dismissed. "One of Blackthorn's men got in a few good hits before I escaped." She wasn't convinced. "Let me see." After a moment's hesitation, Frederick unbuttoned his shirt enough to reveal a purpling bruise across his ribs. Vivian drew in a sharp breath. "We need to bind that," she said decisively, rummaging in her saddlebags for the small medical kit Martha Jenkins had insisted she take. Frederick started to protest, but soon found himself seated again while Vivian expertly wrapped a bandage around his torso. Her fingers were gentle but efficient, betraying a familiarity with treating injuries. "You've done this before," he observed. "My father was shot once during his investigations," she explained, securing the bandage. "We couldn't risk a doctor, so I learned to manage on my own." When she finished, their faces were inches apart, her hands still resting lightly against his side. For a long moment, neither moved, caught in an awareness of each other that transcended their dangerous circumstances. It was Frederick who finally broke the spell, clearing his throat and reaching for his shirt. "Thank you," he said softly. Vivian nodded, busying herself with repacking the medical supplies to hide the flush spreading across her cheeks. By the time she looked up again, Frederick had rebuttoned his shirt and was checking his saddle. "We should reach Elkhorn Creek by nightfall," he said, all business once more. "There's good shelter there, and fresh water." They set off within the hour, riding at a steady pace through the forested mountains. The day was pleasantly warm, birds calling from the treetops and sunlight dappling the trail ahead. Had they been ordinary travelers, it might have been a journey to savor. As they rode, Frederick shared what he knew of the territory ahead, which valleys to avoid, where they might find game if their provisions ran low, which landmarks would guide them toward the settlement he'd mentioned. Vivian listened attentively, impressed by his knowledge and increasingly curious about the man himself. "You said you used to hunt in these mountains," she ventured during a brief rest. "Was that before or after you lost your family?" Frederick stiffened slightly, and Vivian immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "That's not my business. No, it's all right." He adjusted Storm's saddle strap with unnecessary attention. "It was after. I came out here to get away from things for a while." When he didn't continue, Vivian thought the subject closed. But after they remounted and continued along the trail, Frederick surprised her by speaking again. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a little boy named Thomas." His voice was quiet but steady. "We had a small place near Jefferson City. Nothing fancy, but it was ours." Vivian remained silent, sensing he needed to tell the story in his own way. "In the spring of '73, influenza swept through the area. Thomas got sick first, just a fever at first, then it settled in his chest." Frederick's eyes stayed fixed on the trail ahead. "Sarah nursed him day and night. By the time the doctor reached us, she was showing symptoms too." "Frederick, I'm so sorry," Vivian said softly. He acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "Thomas was only 4. He went quick, at least didn't suffer long. Sarah lingered nearly 2 weeks." His hands tightened on the reins. "I buried them side by side under the big oak behind our house. Sold the place a month later. Couldn't bear to stay." The simple tragedy of it struck Vivian deeply. Not a dramatic tale of outlaws or violence, but the quiet devastation of illness, something that had claimed countless frontier families. "That's why you've been drifting," she realized. "You've been running from the memories." Frederick gave her a sidelong glance, surprised by her insight. "I suppose I have. Seems easier than staying in one place, building something that might be taken away again." "And yet you stopped to help a stranger in Wyatt," Vivian pointed out gently. "You could have kept riding, kept drifting." He was silent for so long that she thought she'd overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice had softened. "Something about you reminded me that there are still things worth fighting for in this world." The simple statement hung between them, neither willing to examine too closely what it might mean. Instead, they rode on in companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts as the sun began its westward descent. Elkhorn Creek appeared as Frederick had promised, a clear stream cutting through a protected valley, with flat ground suitable for camping and plentiful firewood. They arrived as twilight deepened, the first stars appearing overhead. While Frederick tended the horses, Vivian gathered wood for a small fire. Soon they had a cheerful blaze going, its warmth welcome as the mountain air cooled with nightfall. They ate a simple meal, their conversation turning to practical matters: how long to the settlement, what supplies they'd need, the safest route to Colorado from there. But beneath the practicalities lay an unspoken awareness of something changing between them, a connection forming that neither had anticipated. As they prepared for sleep, Frederick insisted on taking first watch despite his obvious fatigue. "You barely slept last night," Vivian protested. "I can take the first shift." "I'm fine," he assured her, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "At least rest," she persisted. "I'll wake you if there's any trouble." Too exhausted to argue further, Frederick agreed to lie down near the fire while Vivian sat with her rifle across her lap, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. For a time, the only sounds were the crackling fire and Frederick's increasingly deep, even breathing as sleep claimed him. Vivian found herself studying his face. In repose, the lines of worry smoothed away, making him appear younger and more vulnerable than the capable protector she'd come to rely upon. What would happen, she wondered, when they reached Colorado? When her father's evidence was safely delivered and Blackthorn's crimes exposed? Would Frederick continue his solitary wandering, or might he consider staying? And why did the thought of him leaving cause such an unexpected ache in her chest? The questions circled in her mind as the night deepened around them, bringing no answers but a growing certainty that whatever lay ahead, she was no longer the same woman who had been cornered against a saloon wall in Wyatt. Sometime past midnight, Frederick stirred, sitting up to find Vivian still vigilant by the fire. "You were supposed to wake me," he chided gently. She shrugged. "You needed the rest more than I did." He moved to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Above them, the sky was a canopy of stars, brilliant against the velvet darkness. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Vivian murmured, gazing upward. "Sometimes I think the stars are clearer out here than anywhere else in the world." Frederick followed her gaze. "Sarah used to say they were windows to heaven, that all the souls who'd gone before us were looking down, watching over those they'd left behind." "That's a lovely thought," Vivian said softly. "Do you believe it?" He considered the question seriously. "I'd like to. The idea that they're still out there somewhere, that Thomas and Sarah can see me, it's comforting." "What would they think of you now?" she asked. "Risking your life for a woman you barely know?" Frederick's lips curved in a small, sad smile. "Sarah would approve. She always said I was too quick to mind my own business when others were in trouble." He glanced at Vivian. "She would have liked you. Because I dragged you into trouble. Because you're fighting for something that matters," he corrected. "Because you could have given Blackthorn what he wanted, saved yourself a lot of grief, but you chose to honor your father's sacrifice instead." Vivian stared into the flames. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish, if one list of names is worth all this." "It's not just a list," Frederick reminded her. "It's evidence that no man is above the law, not even someone as powerful and feared as Silas Blackthorn. That matters." His conviction strengthened her resolve. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for helping me, but for understanding why I can't give up." Their eyes met across the firelight, and something passed between them, an understanding deeper than words. For a moment, Vivian thought he might reach for her hand, or perhaps say something more. Instead, he simply nodded and turned his attention back to the fire. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I'll keep watch till morning." Though disappointed by the moments passing, Vivian knew he was right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she would need her strength. She settled near the fire, wrapped in her blanket, and was asleep within minutes. Frederick watched her, the firelight playing across her features. He hadn't planned on caring for Vivian Vance, hadn't planned on caring for anyone after Sarah and Thomas. Yet somehow, in the space of a few days, this determined, courageous woman had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead: the capacity to care, to hope, perhaps even to love again. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. But as he turned his gaze back to the darkness surrounding their camp, Frederick knew that before he could consider any future with Vivian, they first had to survive Blackthorn's vengeance, and that was far from certain. The next day dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for traveling. They broke camp early, erasing all signs of their presence before continuing westward. The terrain gradually changed as they rode, the steep mountains giving way to gentler foothills covered in pine and aspen. By midday, they began to see occasional signs of civilization: a weathered fence line, a rough trail joining their path from the south, smoke from a distant chimney. The settlement Frederick had mentioned was still hours away, but these reminders of human presence lifted their spirits after the isolation of the mountains. "What's this place called?" Vivian asked as they paused to rest the horses. "Clearwater," Frederick replied. "Small but respectable. Has a telegraph office, general store, decent hotel. Most importantly, it has a sheriff who's known for being honest, rare enough in these parts." "You think we should speak to him about Blackthorn?" Frederick considered the question. "Might be wise. He won't be able to do much directly, but he could send word to federal authorities, maybe arrange protection for the rest of our journey." They continued riding through the afternoon, making good time on the improving trail. As the sun began its westward descent, Frederick's prediction proved correct. The settlement of Clearwater came into view, nestled in a valley with a creek running alongside it. From a distance, it looked peaceful enough: a main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, horses and wagons moving about the dusty thoroughfare. Yet as they drew closer, Frederick felt an inexplicable tension gathering between his shoulder blades. "Something's not right," he murmured, reining in his horse on a rise overlooking the town. Vivian stopped beside him. "What is it?" "Not sure." His eyes narrowed as he scanned the buildings below. "Town seems quiet, too quiet for this time of day." Now that he'd mentioned it, Vivian noticed it too: the unnatural stillness of the place. A few people moved along the boardwalks, but they seemed hurried, furtive. No children played in the streets, no groups gathered to socialize. "Maybe they're having some kind of trouble," she suggested. "Illness in town, or Blackthorn got here first," Frederick finished grimly. The possibility sent a chill through Vivian. How could he? We lost them in the mountains. He knows where we're headed: Colorado. There aren't many settlements between here and there. Frederick's hand moved to his revolver, checking it instinctively. He could have ridden ahead while his men continued searching the mountains. "What do we do?" "Go around." Frederick weighed their options. Going around would mean another day or two in the wilderness with dwindling supplies. Entering Clearwater was risky, but they needed provisions and information. "We go in," he decided, "but carefully. Stay close to me and be ready to ride at the first sign of trouble." They approached the town from the east, keeping to the tree line as long as possible before being forced onto the main trail. As they rode past the first buildings, a blacksmith's forge and a livery stable, both eerily quiet, Frederick maintained a vigilant watch for any sign of Blackthorn or his men. The main street stretched before them, lined with the usual frontier businesses: general store, hotel, barber shop, saloon. A few townspeople glanced their way, then quickly averted their eyes and hurried on. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as palpable as the dust hanging in the late afternoon air. "Sheriff's office is at the far end," Frederick murmured, nodding toward a small building with a wooden star hanging above its door. We'll head there first." They had barely reached the middle of town when the saloon doors swung open and a familiar figure stepped out onto the boardwalk. Silas Blackthorn looked no worse for wear despite the chase through the mountains, his dark clothes immaculate, his gun belt prominently displayed. He spotted them immediately, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, right on schedule, Cowboy." Frederick drew his horse to a halt, positioning himself slightly in front of Vivian. "Blackthorn." The gunslinger leaned casually against a post. "Thought you were clever, didn't you? Leading my men on a merry chase through the mountains while you and the lady escaped." "Clever enough," Frederick replied evenly. "You look like you've been waiting a while. Must be getting impatient in your old age." Blackthorn's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "Age teaches patience, Hayes. Also teaches a man to anticipate his opponent's moves." He gestured expansively at the town around them. "Clearwater's the only settlement between those mountains and the Colorado border. Wasn't hard to figure you'd come this way." As he spoke, Blackthorn's men emerged from various buildings, two from the saloon, another from the general store, a fourth from an alley between the barber shop and hotel. They spread out, effectively surrounding Frederick and Vivian. "Town's a bit quiet today," Blackthorn continued conversationally. "Sheriff had an unfortunate accident this morning, took a bad fall, broke both legs. Doc says he'll be laid up for weeks. Terrible timing." Frederick's jaw tightened at the implication. Without the sheriff, Clearwater was at Blackthorn's mercy, and so were they. "What do you want, Blackthorn?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The gunslinger's expression turned cold. "You know what I want. The list. The real one this time." Frederick felt Vivian tense beside him. They were outnumbered, outgunned, with nowhere to run. Yet surrendering the list meant not only betraying Vivian's father's memory but likely signing their own death warrants as well. "And if we refuse?" he asked, playing for time as he assessed their increasingly dire situation. Blackthorn shrugged. "Then things get unpleasant for everyone, starting with the good people of Clearwater." He nodded toward a young woman hurrying across the street, clutching a child's hand. "Lot of innocent folks here who'd suffer for your stubbornness." It was a masterful trap. Blackthorn had correctly guessed that neither Frederick nor Vivian would willingly endanger innocent townspeople. Yet giving him what he wanted offered no guarantee of safety for anyone. Frederick glanced at Vivian, saw the conflict in her eyes that surely mirrored his own. They needed a third option, one that Blackthorn hadn't anticipated. "All right," Frederick said finally, his voice resigned. "You win, Blackthorn, but not here in the street. We do this private-like." The gunslinger studied him suspiciously. "The hotel has a private dining room. We'll talk there." He gestured toward the two-story building across the street. "Dismount slowly. Any sudden moves and my boys start shooting." With little choice, Frederick and Vivian complied, tying their horses to the hitching post in front of the hotel. As they did, Frederick leaned close to Vivian, whispering urgently, "Follow my lead. When I move, run for the telegraph office." She gave him a barely perceptible nod, her face composed despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Blackthorn and two of his men escorted them into the hotel, while the others remained outside, watching the street. The hotel lobby was deserted except for a nervous clerk who quickly disappeared into a back room at Blackthorn's glare. The private dining room was a small chamber off the main restaurant, furnished with a single table and 6 chairs. Blackthorn gestured for them to enter first, then followed with his men, closing the door behind them. "Now," he said, all pretense of civility gone, "the list. Hand it over." Frederick stepped slightly away from Vivian, drawing Blackthorn's attention. "Not that simple. The list isn't on us." The gunslinger's hand moved to his revolver. "Don't try my patience, Hayes." "I'm not lying," Frederick insisted. "After our last encounter, we hit it. Insurance, you might say." "Where?" Blackthorn demanded. Frederick maintained a calm exterior, though his mind was racing through possibilities. "Near the creek where we camped, under a marked stone about 50 yards upstream from the fire pit." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to believe you left something that valuable just sitting under a rock, wrapped in oilcloth, buried 6 inches deep," Frederick elaborated. "Safer than carrying it, considering you were on our trail." The gunslinger considered this, clearly uncertain whether to believe him. "Jenkins," he said to one of his men, "take Wilson and ride out to check. You know where they made camp?" The man nodded. "Saw the remains of their fire when we scouted ahead." "Go," Blackthorn ordered. "The rest of us will wait here." His cold gaze returned to Frederick. "For your sake, Cowboy, that list better be exactly where you said." As one of the men departed, Frederick felt the odds shifting slightly in their favor, 4 against 2 instead of 5 against 2. Still terrible, but marginally better. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, not waiting for permission before pulling out a chair. "Been a long ride." Blackthorn remained standing, as did his remaining henchmen. "You've led us on quite a chase, Hayes. Got to admit, I'm curious why. The woman, I understand it was her father's fight. But you? What's your stake in all this?" Frederick shrugged. "Wrong place, wrong time, story of my life." "Or perhaps the right place," Vivian interjected, speaking for the first time since entering the room. "For once." Something in her tone made Frederick glance at her, struck by the quiet strength in her voice despite their predicament. Their eyes met briefly, conveying volumes without words. Blackthorn caught the exchange and smiled unpleasantly. "Ah, I see. The lady's charms have clouded your judgment." "Understandable, I suppose, but ultimately foolish." Outside, hoofbeats signaled Jenkins and Wilson departing on their fool's errand. Frederick knew they'd find nothing at the campsite. Buying time had been his only goal. Now he needed to create an opportunity for escape before they returned empty-handed, and Blackthorn's limited patience evaporated completely. "While we're waiting," Frederick said casually, "mind if I ask how a man like you got into counterfeiting?" Seems an elaborate scheme for someone who made his reputation with a gun. The question caught Blackthorn off guard. "You're stalling, Hayes. Just making conversation." Frederick leaned back in his chair, affecting a relaxed posture he didn't remotely feel. "Must have taken connections, resources. Not the sort of operation a lone gunman typically manages." A flicker of pride crossed Blackthorn's face despite himself. "You think small, Cowboy. Always more money in business than straightforward robbery if you've got the vision for it." "And friends in high places, I imagine," Frederick pressed. "Government officials who look the other way provide the right papers." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You seem awfully interested in details that don't concern you." Frederick shrugged. "Just trying to understand what I'm caught up in." He glanced at the window, gauging the fading light outside. "Sun's getting low. Your men should be at the creek by now." The observation was calculated to make Blackthorn check his pocket watch, which he did. And in that brief moment of distraction, Frederick made his move. In one fluid motion, he flipped the heavy oak table upward, sending it crashing into Blackthorn and his remaining henchmen. Simultaneously, he shouted, "Now, Vivian!" Vivian didn't hesitate. As Frederick created the diversion, she bolted for the door, wrenching it open and sprinting through the hotel lobby. Behind her, chaos erupted: shouts, curses, the crash of furniture, and then the distinctive crack of gunfire. Her heart in her throat, Vivian burst onto the street, momentarily disoriented by the dusky light. The telegraph office. Frederick had said to run for the telegraph office. She spotted it 3 buildings down, its windows still illuminated despite the late hour. Two of Blackthorn's men remained on the street, both initially startled by her sudden appearance. As they recovered and reached for their weapons, more gunshots sounded from inside the hotel, drawing their attention momentarily away from Vivian. She seized the opportunity, gathering her skirts and running full tilt toward the telegraph office. Behind her, someone shouted whether Frederick or one of Blackthorn's men, she couldn't tell. She didn't look back, focusing solely on reaching the telegraph office and the slim hope of help it represented. The door yielded to her desperate push, and she stumbled inside to find a startled telegrapher, a young man with spectacles perched on his nose staring at her in alarm. "I need to send a telegram immediately," she gasped. "It's a matter of life and death." Outside, more gunshots rang out closer now. The telegrapher's eyes widened in fear. "What in tarnation, please?" Vivian begged, reaching into her pocket for the leather pouch. "There's no time to explain." The young man hesitated only briefly before nodding toward his machine. "Who's it to?" Vivian quickly extracted a folded paper from the pouch, not the list itself, but a name and address her father had given her for emergencies. "This man, at the federal marshal's office in Denver." As the telegrapher began tapping out the message, the street outside erupted in more gunfire. Vivian peered anxiously through the window, her heart pounding with fear for Frederick. Had he escaped the hotel? Was he even still alive? Her answer came moments later when the door burst open and Frederick himself staggered in, blood seeping from a wound in his left arm. "Frederick," she cried, rushing to his side. "Keep sending," he ordered the wide-eyed telegrapher who had frozen at his entrance. To Vivian he added, "Blackthorn's down but not dead. His men are regrouping." "You're hurt," she said, quickly examining his arm. "Just a graze." He grimaced, peering out the window cautiously. "We need to hold them off until that telegram goes through. Help should arrive from the next town over within hours if we're lucky." The telegrapher looked up from his machine. "I've sent the initial message. What else should I include?" Vivian quickly dictated the essentials: their location, Blackthorn's presence, the danger to the town. Frederick, meanwhile, barricaded the door with a heavy desk, then checked his revolver. Only 2 bullets remained. "Back door?" he asked the telegrapher. The young man nodded. "Through the storeroom, leads to an alley." Frederick glanced at Vivian. "Once that message is sent, we need to move." "Can't stay here, they'll burn us out if necessary." She nodded grimly, understanding the reality of their situation. The telegraph office, while momentarily secure, was ultimately a trap if Blackthorn's men surrounded it. "Message complete," the telegrapher announced, his hands shaking slightly as he stepped away from his machine. "God willing, it reached Denver." "Thank you," Vivian said fervently. "You should leave now through the back. Get somewhere safe." The young man hesitated. "What about you folks?" "We'll follow," Frederick assured him. "Go on." Once the telegrapher had disappeared into the storeroom, Frederick turned to Vivian. "The list, is it secure?" She patted her pocket. "Still here." "Good." He peered out the window again, assessing the situation in the street. "Blackthorn's men are taking positions. We've got minutes at most." "What's the plan?" Vivian asked, her voice steady despite the desperate circumstances. Frederick's admiration for her courage grew even as he struggled to formulate a viable strategy. With his ammunition nearly depleted and Blackthorn's men closing in, their options were severely limited. "The livery," he decided. "If we can reach it unseen through the back alleys, we might be able to get to our horses or find fresh mounts. It's our best chance of getting out of town." Vivian nodded, trusting his judgment despite the long odds. "Lead the way." They slipped through the storeroom and out the back door into a narrow alley that ran behind the main street buildings. Dusk had deepened into true night, providing some cover as they moved cautiously between shadows, ears straining for any sound of pursuit. They had nearly reached the cross alley that would lead them toward the livery when a figure stepped out from behind a stack of crates, revolver raised. "That's far enough," Blackthorn himself growled, his face half hidden in shadow but the menace in his voice unmistakable. Blood darkened one side of his jacket. Frederick's bullet had found a mark after all, but not a fatal one. Frederick instinctively pushed Vivian behind him, his own gun coming up despite the knowledge that he was outmatched. Blackthorn was a renowned gunman, and Frederick was down to his last 2 bullets. "Impressive play back there, Cowboy," Blackthorn said, his breathing labored but his gun hand steady. "But it ends now. The list. Last chance." Frederick's mind raced, searching for options that didn't end with both of them dead in this filthy alley. Before he could speak, Vivian stepped out from behind him. "Wait," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. She reached slowly into her pocket, withdrawing the leather pouch. "Vivian, don't," Frederick protested. She gave him a look he couldn't quite interpret. "My father wouldn't want more bloodshed over this, not at the cost of innocent lives." To Blackthorn, she said, "Here's what you want, take it and let us go." Blackthorn's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Toss it here," slowly. Vivian hesitated, then lobbed the pouch toward him. It landed in the dirt at his feet. Still keeping his gun trained on them, Blackthorn bent slightly to retrieve it. In that instant of divided attention, Frederick heard a soft click from beside him. Too late. He realized what Vivian had done while Blackthorn focused on the pouch. She had drawn a small derringer from a hidden pocket in her skirt. The shot was deafening in the confined space of the alley. Blackthorn jerked upright, a look of almost comical surprise on his face as he stared down at the rapidly spreading stain on his chest. His revolver slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, and he crumpled to his knees. "My father taught me more than just horsemanship," Vivian said softly, repeating the words she'd spoken days earlier, though now they carried a weight of finality. Blackthorn opened his mouth as if to speak, but only a wet cough emerged. He toppled sideways into the dirt, eyes still open but seeing nothing. For a moment, neither Frederick nor Vivian moved, the enormity of what had just happened washing over them. Then the sound of shouting from the main street broke the spell. "His men," Frederick said urgently, retrieving the fallen pouch from beside Blackthorn's body. "They'll have heard the shot." They fled deeper into the maze of alleys, the livery still their destination but now with a renewed desperation. Behind them, voices called out in alarm as Blackthorn's men discovered their fallen leader. The livery loomed ahead, its large doors closed for the night but a side entrance offering possible access. Frederick tried the handle locked. "Stand back," he whispered, then used the butt of his revolver to break the small window beside the door. Reaching through, he unlatched it from inside, and they slipped into the relative safety of the dimly lit stable. Their horses were still there, alongside a dozen others. Working quickly and quietly, they saddled them while keeping alert for any sound of pursuit. "We can't go back to the main street," Frederick murmured as he tightened his saddle girth. "They'll have it watched." Vivian nodded toward the large rear doors. "What about through there?" Frederick considered it. "Leads to the back pasture, then open country. Might work if we're quick and quiet about it." They led their horses to the rear doors, easing them open just enough to slip through. The pasture beyond was dark, a few other horses grazing peacefully under the emerging stars. In the distance, Blackthorn's men could be heard organizing a search, but they seemed focused on the main street and nearby buildings. "Ready?" Frederick asked, checking Vivian's face in the dim light. She nodded, her expression a complex mixture of determination, regret, and something softer that made his heart beat faster despite their danger. "Together, then," he said quietly, swinging into his saddle. They rode out across the pasture at a walk, keeping low and silent until they reached the cover of trees beyond. Only then did they urge their horses to greater speed, heading west toward the distant promise of Colorado, and the justice Vivian's father had died seeking. Behind them, Clearwater gradually faded into darkness, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter until there was nothing but the rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind through the trees. As they rode side by side through the night, Frederick glanced at Vivian, this remarkable woman who had shown such courage and resolve. She had killed a man tonight, a burden he wished she didn't have to carry. Yet there was no denying that Blackthorn had deserved his fate, or that her action had likely saved both their lives. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Vivian didn't answer immediately, her expression thoughtful as she gazed ahead. "I'm not sure," she admitted finally. "I never thought I'd." "But when he was standing there, threatening us, threatening you." She trailed off, unable to fully articulate the tumult of emotions. "You did what you had to do," Frederick assured her. "What your father would have done." She nodded slowly. "I know, and I'd do it again to protect." She hesitated, then finished softly. "To protect someone I care about." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Frederick found himself reaching across the space that separated them, his hand finding hers. She turned her palm upward, interlacing their fingers as they rode toward whatever future awaited them beyond the horizon. 2 weeks later, the town of Leadville, Colorado, bustled with activity, miners coming off shift, merchants closing shops, saloon doors swinging open to welcome the evening crowd. Among the diverse inhabitants moving through the streets, few paid particular attention to the couple emerging from the law office near the town square. Frederick Hayes held the door for Vivian Vance, his expression a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "It's done, then," he said as they stepped onto the boardwalk. Vivian nodded, clutching a folded document, official confirmation that her testimony and her father's evidence had been received by federal authorities. "The marshal says arrests are already being made across 3 territories. Blackthorn's entire operation is being dismantled." Their journey to Colorado had been arduous but uneventful after the dramatic events in Clearwater. Blackthorn's remaining men, leaderless and disorganized, had apparently abandoned the chase rather than pursue them across territorial lines. Upon reaching Denver, they'd been met by federal marshals who had received Vivian's telegram and escorted them safely to Leadville, where her father's investigation had originated. For the past 10 days, Vivian had provided statements, identified names on the list, and testified to everything she had witnessed. Frederick had remained steadfastly by her side, his own testimony corroborating hers, and adding weight to the case against Blackthorn's Confederates. Now, with their official business concluded, they stood at a crossroads, not just physically, but in their lives. "What will you do now?" Frederick asked as they walked toward the modest hotel where they'd been staying. Vivian glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "I still have my father's property outside Denver. It's been neglected, but the deed is clear. I thought I might try to rebuild there." Frederick nodded, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest at the thought of their paths diverging. These past weeks with Vivian had awakened something in him he'd thought lost forever, a desire for connection, for permanence, for a future shared rather than endured alone. "It sounds like a good plan," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "You'd be near your aunt and uncle, have family around you." "Yes," she agreed, then added quietly, "though family isn't always about blood." They reached the hotel and paused on its wide porch, watching the sunset paint Leadville's buildings in shades of gold and copper. The mountains beyond the town stood sentinel, their peaks still snow-capped even in early summer. "It's beautiful country," Frederick observed, his eyes not on the scenery but on Vivian's profile. "It is," she agreed, turning to face him fully. "Too beautiful to experience alone, I think." Their eyes met, and the unspoken question hung between them. Frederick took a deep breath, gathering courage for a leap of faith greater than any he'd taken in facing down Blackthorn. "Vivian," he began hesitantly, "these past weeks have been, I never expected." She waited, her green eyes patient yet expectant. "What I'm trying to say," he continued, the words coming easier now, "is that meeting you has changed everything for me. For years I've been drifting, running from memories, afraid to put down roots again. But now. She prompted softly when he paused. "Now I find myself wanting a home again, a purpose." He took her hands in his. "A future that includes you if you'll have me." Vivian's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with joy. "Is that a proposal, Frederick Hayes?" He laughed, some of the tension easing from his shoulders. "I suppose it is, though not a very eloquent one." "I don't need eloquence," she replied, stepping closer until barely a breath separated them. "I just need you. Yes, Frederick. Yes, I'll have you." The kiss that followed felt like coming home, like finding a peace neither had thought possible when they'd first locked eyes across a dusty street in Wyatt, Missouri, with a gunslinger's threat hanging in the air between them. When they finally parted, Frederick kept his arms around her waist, unwilling to let go of this newfound happiness. "Your father's ranch," he said thoughtfully. "It would take work to restore it." "Good thing I know a capable ranch hand," Vivian teased, her eyes bright with plans for their future. "Though I was thinking we might raise horses instead of cattle, start a breeding program with good stock." Frederick nodded, warming to the idea. "I know a bit about horses, and construction we could expand the house eventually." "For when we need the room," she agreed, a blush coloring her cheeks at the implication. The thought of children, a family with Vivian, filled Frederick with both joy and a momentary flash of fear. He thought of Thomas, of Sarah, of the devastating loss that had sent him wandering. Vivian seemed to read his thoughts. "We can't know what the future holds," she said gently, touching his cheek. "But I'd rather face its uncertainties together than miss its joys for fear of pain." Her wisdom, so simply stated, washed away the last of his hesitation. "Together, then," he agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. As twilight deepened around them, neither was in any hurry to move from the porch, content for now to simply be together, planning their future in quiet conversation as Leadville's evening life continued around them. A month later, under a clear Colorado sky, Frederick Hayes and Vivian Vance were married in a simple ceremony at her aunt and uncle's home in Denver. The guests were few family members, the federal marshal who had helped bring Blackthorn's accomplices to justice, and, somewhat surprisingly, Ezra and Martha Jenkins, who had traveled all the way from Missouri for the occasion. "Wouldn't have missed it," Ezra declared, clapping Frederick on the shoulder at the small reception afterward. "Known you were a goner the minute I saw how you looked at her back at our place." Frederick laughed, no longer embarrassed by how transparent his feelings had apparently been. "Smartest thing I ever did, following her to Colorado." "Second smartest," Martha corrected with a knowing smile. "First was facing down that gunslinger in Wyatt." Later, as the celebration continued around them, Frederick and Vivian slipped away to the garden behind the house, seeking a moment of quiet together. "Happy, Mrs. Hayes?" Frederick asked, still marveling at the sound of her new name. Vivian's smile was answer enough, but she added, "More than I ever thought possible. And you?" Any regrets about trading your wandering ways for a settled life? He shook his head firmly. None, though I'm not sure settled is quite the word for starting a new ranch from scratch. True enough, she laughed. We'll have our work cut out for us. They had already begun that work, spending the weeks since their arrival in Colorado assessing the condition of Vivian's father's property. The main house needed substantial repairs, and the fences and outbuildings were in worse shape, but the land itself was rich and beautiful 60 acres of rolling pasture backed by forest and a clear stream. I was thinking, Frederick said, his tone turning more serious, about naming the place. Every ranch should have a proper name. Vivian looked interested. Did you have something in mind? He nodded, suddenly a bit self-conscious. What about Sunset Ranch? To remember how we met you cornered by Blackthorn as the sun was going down. And you facing him down, telling me to run to you, she finished softly. I like it. Sunset Ranch it is. A call from the house indicated that their absence had been noted time to return to their guests. But before they did, Frederick pulled Vivian close for one more private moment. I want you to know, he said, his voice low with emotion, that I'll spend every day of my life grateful for whatever twist of fate brought me to Wyatt that day. Vivian's eyes shimmered with unshed tears of happiness. As will I, my love, as will I. 5 years later, Sunset Ranch was barely recognizable from the abandoned property they had first surveyed. The house stood proud and well-maintained, expanded to include a spacious kitchen and additional bedrooms. The barn housed 12 breeding mares and 3 stallions, the foundation of what was becoming one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the territory. On a warm June evening, Frederick sat on the front porch, watching his 3-year-old son Thomas chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The boy was the image of his father, with the same determined set to his jaw, though he had his mother's green eyes. Don't go too far, Tommy, Frederick called as the child ventured toward the edge of the yard. He's fine, Vivian said, emerging from the house with a sleeping infant cradled against her shoulder, their daughter Sarah, just 4 months old and already showing signs of her mother's spirit. Frederick rose to make room for Vivian on the porch swing, then sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders while the other gently stroked his daughter's downy head. Letter came today from the Jenkins, Vivian said, settling comfortably against him. Ezra says they're considering selling their place and moving west. I told him we could use experienced hands around here. Frederick smiled at the thought of having their old friends nearby. That would be fine indeed. This place is big enough for all of us. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Thomas's explorations and enjoying the peaceful end to another productive day. The sun sank lower, casting golden light across the ranch they had built together, the home they had created from dreams and determination. You know, Vivian said softly, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been in Wyatt that day, if you hadn't stepped out when Blackthorn had me cornered. Frederick tightened his arm around her shoulders. I try not to think about it. Some things are just meant to be, I suppose. She turned her face up to his, eyes filled with the same love that had grown steadily between them through years of shared work, joy, and occasional hardship. I'm glad you told me to run to you, she whispered. So am I, he replied, bending to kiss her softly. So am I. As twilight deepened into night, they called Thomas in from his adventures, the 4 of them completing the circle of family that had seemed impossible to Frederick not so many years ago. The ghosts of his past had not vanished entirely. He still thought of his first wife and son with tender remembrance, but they no longer haunted him. Instead, they had become gentle reminders of life's preciousness and the importance of embracing love when it appeared, even in the most unexpected circumstances. Together, Frederick and Vivian Hayes had transformed tragedy into triumph, danger into security, and two solitary journeys into one shared path. As they tucked their children into bed and prepared for another day on Sunset Ranch, they did so with the quiet certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced Silas Blackthorn, standing side by side, drawing strength from each other's courage and comfort from each other's love. And when the sun set each evening over their Colorado home, painting the sky in the same fiery hues that had witnessed their first meeting, they remembered the words that had changed their lives forever. "Run to me." Words that had been not just a desperate instruction in a moment of danger, but a promise that had shaped every day since, a promise of protection, of partnership, of a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle and brave enough to build a future from the ashes of the past.